Welcome everyone. It's fantastic to have so many people registered for today. I'm Dr. Jess Heron, I'm the Chief Executive of APP. Thanks for joining the APP for our lunchtime seminar in collaboration with the National Centre for Mental Health at Cardiff University, GPCPC, which is a network of GPs championing perinatal mental health care, and the International Journal of Birth and Parent Education. Today's seminar is delivered in memory of Alex Baish. It brings together key knowledge for health professionals with the aim of making birth safer for people who experience postpartum psychosis. We'll hear from Richard Baish about what he hopes to achieve with this series of free annual seminars. We'll hear from acclaimed writer and APP ambassador Laura Dockrell about the impact and risks of postpartum psychosis and why antenatal education and health professional training on this topic is vital. We're joined by 6 expert panelists who'll share data and knowledge from their work. Dr. Rock Cantwell, a retired perinatal psychiatrist and an advisor on perinatal mental health to the Scottish Government and past author on the confidential inquiries into maternal deaths. Dr. Sally Wilson, who's training lead for APP, Professor Ian Jones, Director of the National Centre for Mental Health at Cardiff University, Dr. Giles Beresford, who's APP Chair and National Specialty Advisor in Perinatal Mental Health to NHS England, and Dr. Judy Shakespeare and Dr. Cathy Smith, who are Deputy Chair and committee members of the GPCPC. If all goes to plan, there'll be about 20 minutes for your questions at the end. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, so type your questions in there and we'll see how many we get through. Any that we don't get to, we'll put a resource together and send round after the webinar. We know that this can be a difficult topic for many people. It is recorded, so if you don't want to watch it right now, then there'll be a recording which we'll put on a landing page on the website, and you can watch it at a time that feels okay for you. If you're a member of our Postpartum Psychosis Lived Experience Committee, there's also people on the forum all day, every day that you can talk to, or send us an email as well, and someone will get back to you. I want to warmly thank Richard, his family, Alex's family, his friends, and everyone who supported his fundraising to make this event and APP's antenatal education campaign and toolkit possible. I'll now hand over to Richard to tell you more.
Excuse me, thanks very much, Jess. So yeah, as Jess said, my name's Rich Baish, and unfortunately I can't honestly sit here and say that it's a pleasure to be here. I'd do anything not to be here. I'd do anything to be living my everyday life as a teacher, to come home to my wife and my 2 children, and to have an idyllic life as we'd hoped this time last year. What I want to do in the next 5 minutes is to provide as much context on postpartum psychosis as possible, to make everyone, as many people as possible, aware of the damning consequences that it can have on a family and actually a community. Alex was a teacher. And to make people realise that it's a real thing and it should be treated by medical professionals with the utmost attention and diligence. So for a few weeks, I should say, this time last year, we'd reached as a family what we thought was the Holy Grail. We had everything we'd ever dreamed of in life, and Alex's deterioration started almost to the day this time a year ago. It was completely out of the blue. It was very sudden. It was very quick. It was very dramatic. She had no history of mental health issues at all. There was no trigger in her life which one could point to as the root cause of what happened. In spite of that, fundamentally, postpartum psychosis is a treatable illness. I hold nothing against the individuals who dealt with Alex. Just like if I'm giving my class a test, I'm not going to blame any child who doesn't know an answer if they've not been taught it. If you don't know something, you can't be to blame. But if they had known, if they had been able to spot the signs that Alex was going through something so serious, if they treated it as a medical emergency like it should have been, then Alex would still be with us today. And while this is the most heartbreaking thing that I've ever had to face, I'm also taking it as the most motivating thing that I've ever been presented with, an opportunity, if you like. The analogy that I use is that losing Alex is a lot like losing a sense. You lose your sight okay, while your life can never be the same, you rely on your other senses to help you cope. You adapt. And I've learned this year that to try as much as I can to not focus on the negatives, but to reflect on the positive things that I still have in my life and the positive influence that I'm able to have on society, albeit in my small capacity that I have at the moment. My family's life will always face a deficit for the rest of our lives. But what I'm absolutely desperate for is for Alex's life not to be lost in vain. If we're able to spread the word, and if today's seminar is able to save a life, 5 lives, 10 lives, 100 lives, 1,000 lives, then it's going to put me much more at ease with the situation and much more at peace as well. That from a societal point of view, there's a positive legacy that Alex will continue to leave. Before we get on to the main speakers, I just wanted to give a couple of thank yous. First of all, to APP. It's just an incredible charity. It's a small but mighty charity that are doing really great things, and they've helped set up today, so I'm forever indebted to them. I wanted to give a quick thank you to Laura, who you're going to hear from in a minute, who's just the most amazing person, and I'm so grateful to know her and to thrive off her positivity. So Laura, you're a legend. Thank you. And I also just wanted to say that it takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a village to support a family that are going through what I've been through. So I want to say thank you to everyone who's supported me in whatever way through the last year. But most importantly, thank you at the moment to all of you who are here, giving up their lunch break in what is a very busy world, for being here. Ultimately, we're all here for one reason, and that's to help save lives and make a positive difference, and you're all doing that. So I'm forever thankful to you for the support that you've given today and the time you've given up today. So I'll pass you over to Laura now, and yeah, thank you.
I love you, Rich.
Thank you, love you too.
I really do. And also thank you so much to APP. I feel a bit like I'm appearing naked in front of you right now. That's the thing about surviving a monstrous mental illness. It can make you fearless. I appear to have, for good or bad, lost all sense of dignity and shame, freeing me up to do stuff like, I don't know, share the most traumatic moment of my entire life here on Zoom in front of hundreds of strangers. So here we go, get comfy. In 2018, I lost my mind. I had never experienced poor mental health before. Until that point, I had spent 31 years on the Earth's crust, happy, healthy, with a bright, shining view of the world. Some actual real-life dreams of mine had become realities. I was writing full-time, and the boy that I had fancied since I was 14 years old, I know, talk about desperate, had finally just told me that he fancied me back. And then we got pregnant. I felt like I was walking on air. But just hours after our baby was born, during a traumatic and chaotic labour, I began to unravel. One day I was me, and the next day I was not. I woke up on my first Mother's Day in a psychiatric ward. I know you really couldn't make it up, separated from my newborn, with no idea how or why I got there. My baby son Jet was just 3 weeks old. This almost invisible illness was an assassin, an apparition that nobody else could see. My brain, that was meant to be my friend, had turned on me, was stabbing me in the back, and was now a house of horrors, a black hole, a phone waiting to ring. My brain was on fire or frozen in ice. My brain that had the upper hand because it knew all of my very darkest secrets, my weaknesses and fears, was now a hunter, relentless, following a trail of my own blood, and I had an X on my back. My brain was a bear trap, CCTV, rot, wasps, tinned fish, a speeding motorway. My brain was the drunkest person at the party that had to be carried home by a stranger with spaghetti ankles and shame, a robbed house. My brain was held at knife point, a vulnerable child star being aggressively blasted by the flashing bullets of paparazzi cameras, the love of your life kissing someone else in slow motion. My brain was a kid left out of a game by its friends, a missed alarm. I was drowning in a shower. You can't drown in a shower, but oh yes, you can. And I swirled down the plug hole. I was suffering with the debilitating mental illness postpartum psychosis. PP is different to postnatal depression, affects roughly 1 in 500 women a year, and is considered a medical emergency. Don't worry, I hadn't heard of it either until it tried to ruin my life. There is little understanding of exactly how or why the illness comes on. Its triggers can vary. For many sufferers, as in my case, it appeared out of the blue, and yet I've been picking up the pieces of this shipwreck ever since. We know too well the depictions of crazy women tropes in stories, the associations with women and madness throughout history, of female hysteria, from spent nerves, overreaction, too sensitive, emotional, dramatic to witchcraft, the woman in the attic in Jane Eyre, psycho killer villainesses, etc. The list goes on. And there is an overplayed, insidious tabloid media stereotype too of what someone suffering with postnatal mental illness looks like. The faded woman with her washed out, scrubby dressing gown, as Sylvia Plath puts it, stewing in her own sour air. People don't want to talk about this heavy stuff at the best of times, and especially not around children. The silence is deafening. It disarms our power and our agency, our language to ask for help and tools to recover too. Silence only inflames the symptoms, the stigma, and creates an ideal culture for a mental illness to thrive. Shame, judgment, and fear follow fast in its wake, and it's a perfect storm, one that can unfortunately end in tragedy. But it doesn't have to. Postpartum psychosis is treatable. I talk from the vantage point of privilege, being a healthy middle-class white woman with a loving partner and supportive family in the UK, where the healthcare system is exceptional compared to most parts of the world. And yet, in what is meant to be the best time of our lives, suicide is the main cause of death in women after the first year of having a baby. And they said we'd be glowing. So can we please talk about this now? There are many dangerous dinosaur old narratives that link women with pain, our tolerance, our strength, our don't worry about little old me approach, our inability to cry out for help, and over-ability to take care and prioritise others. Childbirth is billed as the ultimate human athletics. For me to get a gold medal meant enduring the most natural birth without any pain relief or intervention and taking to breastfeeding like an absolute champ. I was scared, vulnerable and traumatised, grieving my old self, a child in a woman's body, trying to become a mum whilst desperately needing my own. Guilt, feelings of failure and shame ate me like buttered toast for breakfast. There were also moments where I felt Herculean and monstrous, like I could move mountains or lift cars, channeling some form of hysterical strength, my footsteps thunderous and my heart soaring. In my psychotic state, I was animalistic, primal, raw, also mostly naked. There is a spectrum, and my experience is extreme, but after talking about this, yes, I am now a self-enrolled postpartum police patrol officer now. It turns out I am really not alone. 8 out of 10 women struggle in the weeks after giving birth. We are all too aware of the physical changes that carrying and birthing a child can make to our bodies, but what about our minds? So why aren't we passing down this golden information along with all the other tips and tricks of unsolicited advice? It seems to be the bit they leave out in the what to expect when we're expecting bit. And so the conspiracy in silence lives on. At the psychiatric ward, they would say, the only path out of hell is through misery. And I'd be like, oh, great, thanks so much. As I began dragging my weary, tired animal of a body down that miserable path out of hell. I was so sure I was going to die that this illness would kill me. I speak from the heart with insight and acceptance and don't blame anyone for my experience. But with my symptoms undiagnosed, I was very close to crisis point. What more signs does a person have to show to demonstrate that they are severely unwell and unsafe? It takes an enormous amount of courage for anyone to say they are suffering and struggling in the first place, to only be met with a slip of paper carrying the name of a website, a referral in the distant future, a callback, a prescription for something we might not understand or be frightened of, just doesn't seem good enough. Mental illness is often mostly invisible, but if we could see it, there is no way anybody would say, wait, ride it out, and the fix isn't quick. I have seen somewhere I can't unsee, felt something I can't unfeel, and I don't want to hide or run in shame from that. When I began to unravel my unravelment, I felt a powerful urge to call out my illness as a bully, tear the mask off the killer's face, out the secret, blow the whistle and smash the stigma. People would say, but it wasn't you, Laura, it was the illness. But I feel like, no, that was me, thank you. It wasn't my fault, but it was me. Look at what I did to get out of that. I am proud. It is a celebration. It is a love story. To my partner, Hugo, to my son, Jet, to my own mum, to myself, to the human condition and its limitless resilience. When Jet was 6 months old, I began writing about my experience. And the day my memoir, What Have I Done, published, there was no running or hiding. I felt like I was walking down the aisle with my illness, arm in pride to, I don't know, All You Need Is Love by the Beatles or something. Love proved to be the medicine to fix me. Now, almost 6 years away, I live alongside my experience. Recovery is precious to me. Keeping my head screwed on is my main priority. I have a toddler that really needs me. And plus, it turns out I really like not being mad. I used to keep myself awake at night trying to make sense of what had happened to me. As you can imagine, I had lots of questions. My GP gave me a referral to speak to the leading psychiatrist in my illness, Dr. Ian Jones, who is here today and is amazing. My biggest question, which unsurprisingly is the most common question most people ask when suffering with a severe mental illness: why me? And his response was quite simply, it just wasn't your day. And I can live with that. It just wasn't my day. Paternal mental illness is not just a fluffy topic for new parents. It is a universal conversation for all humankind about the human experience and what it means to be alive. There are many ways to bring a small person onto this confusing planet. There are many ways to get unwell, but there are even more ways to get better. Asking for help is the place to start. It is the bravest thing a person can do, but the door has got to be open. The help needs to be there and available for everyone. Thank you so much for listening. I'm now going to pass it on to Rock.
Thank you. And while I share, thank you so much, Laura and Rich, for an incredibly powerful presentation and a description of what you've both been through. That bravery, that eloquence needs to be right at the heart to think of everything we do as professionals as well. I'm going to try sharing my screen and I'm going to, sorry, I'm not the best multitasker in the world. There we are. Hopefully you can all see that. And I'm really conscious that what we're talking about today is a really sensitive subject, is a difficult subject for people. And I think it's important to keep in mind, I'm talking to you about the confidential inquiries into maternal deaths. It's important to keep in mind that the care that most women get is good, but that we focus in these reports on what goes wrong, because that's where we learn the strongest messages to make sure that we can do something better, we can change, we can improve the care that we provide in the future. So please do keep that in mind as we go through the talk, because it can be hard to hang on to that. Confidential inquiries are national inquiries, national reviews of all women who die during pregnancy or up to a year after childbirth. And they've been going on in the UK since the 1950s. And you can see just these are examples of covers from the inquiries, and you can see how the title has changed from being called simply a report through to Why Mothers Die, through to Saving Mothers' Lives, and now Saving Lives, Improving Mothers' Care, to reflect that what we're trying to do is think about all women who go through difficulties during pregnancy and the postnatal period, and try and make changes to improve the care that all of them get, not only those with the most severe illnesses, but obviously the reports tend to focus on those. And you can see from the covers in these slides as well, how, of course, when a tragedy happens, it's not only about the woman, it's about her child, it's about her partner, it's about her family, it's about her older children as well. And we need to keep that in our minds at all times as we think about the lessons we can learn. And I think it was beautifully said by Gwyneth Lewis, who is a past chair of the panel that writes these reports. And what she said was that these inquiries go beyond numbers. It's not about counting people. It's recognizing, respecting that every death is a young woman who died before her time. She was a mother, a member of a family and of her community. And it's our job to listen and to tell the stories of those women so that we can save the lives of other mothers and babies in the future. The first report, as I said to you, came out in around about early 1950s. But the first time they looked in detail at the women who died from mental health difficulties was around the 1990s. So we have about 30 years now almost of really detailed information to help us understand more about the difficulties that women went through, the care they received, and why things went wrong. And in each of those reports that are published, lessons that we learn then to try and make sure that things go better in the future. And there was an interesting report done in 2017. So again, it's this business about moving beyond only, not just for the women who die, but also the women who went through a severe mental illness, to learn lessons about how their care could have been improved as well. And that report in 2017 looked specifically at a group of women who suffered in the past from a postpartum psychosis, like Laura has described, or from bipolar disorder, a mental health condition which we know is closely associated and puts people at greater risk of suffering from postpartum psychosis. So it's to look at that group of women and to see what their care was like in a subsequent pregnancy and whether they got all the extra care that they should have had because of the challenges they had faced in a previous pregnancy. And you can see here, this is from one of the most recent inquiries. You can see that, unfortunately, deaths due to psychiatric causes are right up there in terms of leading causes of death, alongside other causes like deaths due to heart disease. So we've learned lots of lessons, but we haven't necessarily got much better at bringing those numbers down. And that's something we still have to work very hard to do. And you can see here, the other thing that the inquiry for many of the other areas where women suffer major illness or die, other physical causes, focuses very much on women who die during pregnancy or within the early time after having a baby, closely associated with having a baby, with delivery. And you can see that in this pie chart, those two things, drug and alcohol problems and suicide, make up a huge proportion of the women who have died beyond that sort of early time after childbirth, right up to the end of the first postnatal year. So that risk remains continuously throughout at least that time, that up to the end of that first postnatal year. And here I'm just looking at in some of the more recent inquiries going back to the start of the millennium, looking at those women who died, the numbers, the rates of suicide. And you can see that it's bumped along. It hasn't really improved at all. And if anything, we can see in that most recent inquiry, which was published in 2022 and covered 3 years up to that, we can see actually a significant increase. And we may come back and talk a little bit about some of the reasons behind that. I want to tell you some of the things that we know have been associated with women who died by suicide in the perinatal period. And we've known this from the inquiries for some time, but these messages came out again in one of the more recent reports. And you can see there one of the distinctive factors, which is really shocking and always shocks me when I see it, and we find it every time in the reports, is how these women who die by suicide die. And we see that they will often use violent methods to end their lives. And we know this is unusual because it's unusual when we compare that to women other times in their lives who die by suicide, and even when we compare it to men who actually are more likely to use violent methods themselves. So there's something distinctive, there's something different for the women who are suffering from major mental illness at this time, something that makes it very clear that their intent is very strong on ending their lives, and that says something about the seriousness of the illness that they're going through. And you can see that down in the middle at the bottom there is just showing you when these women have died during that time in pregnancy and postnatally, and you can see it's just reinforcing what I said earlier, that the risk is there right up to at the very least to the end of the first postnatal year, although the risk is lower during pregnancy. And I suppose in all of this, it's so important to keep in mind that suicide is still, thankfully, a very, very rare event. But we need to focus on those women for whom their illnesses put them at that sort of risk. This slide tells us a little bit about what sort of underlying mental health difficulty the women who did die in the inquiry were suffering from. And we were able to look back. It's always difficult sometimes to make those diagnoses by looking back, but we were able to see that there was sufficient information for around about 47 of the 62 who died in this inquiry. Excuse me. And we see that around about a quarter, 28%, had a probable or definite psychotic illness. So they had a postpartum psychosis of some type. And that figure varies in most of the inquiries between about 1 in 5, so around about 20%, and about 2 in 5, about 40%. So we see it varying up and down, but in that broad range throughout the inquiries. And this is a really important thing to look at as well. And it shows you the highest level of care that these women had in the episode of illness that led up to their deaths. About 1 in 12 or 8% actually got into a mother and baby unit, had that highest level of care. But if you look, most women were actually being seen, or the biggest proportion rather of women were being seen by their GP or their maternity professional or their health visitor, and no mental health professional. And a proportion, and the next sort of biggest proportion, were being seen by liaison mental health teams or crisis mental health teams, but not by specialist perinatal mental health teams. I'm going to skip over that just given the time that we have and come on to some of the lessons themselves. So the major lesson lessons that we have around risk of suicide are these things, these three that we've picked out in a more recent inquiry. There are other lessons we learned too, but these are particularly important. There's a lesson around significant change in the woman. So her presenting, her appearing as different, or new symptoms emerging differently. So something new, something different, something that's changed for this woman. New thoughts or acts of self-harm or violent self-harm. That was the recommendation in this inquiry, but actually subsequent inquiries widened that out and said actually any act of self-harm is an unusual thing to happen in pregnancy or postnatally and should really alert people to something not being right. And for a small number of women, persistent expressions of incompetency as a mother are feeling very estranged from their infant. Now, there's probably not a single parent out there who hasn't felt, I'm not doing enough for my baby, or I could be doing a bit more, or does my baby love me? These are pretty normal concerns. But these women were so different. They were plagued and tortured by these thoughts. And you can see an example there of a woman who, that symptom pattern, that progression on day 7 with no past history is weepy and anxious, and within 6 days has died. That's very unusual to see outside the perinatal period. And we see another example below that of a woman who became preoccupied about her baby's health and her belief that she was no good as a mother. She couldn't be reassured by others, and people thought this was just adjustment. But actually, when you read back, this woman probably had a postpartum psychosis. Oftentimes, we see people initially presenting just with anxiety symptoms, but what we need to monitor is that rapid change that can happen over such a short period of time. And what often happens is that as professionals, or what happens in where things go wrong, is the professionals don't see that pattern of progression. And we tend to think of things, of using terms like if an act of self-harm has been impulsive, maybe it's not serious. Or that a woman says, well, I wouldn't do it because of the children, but she may have already harmed herself. And although she may well believe that in her own head, when she's overwhelmed by the illness and by the anxieties, then it's hard for her to not react in a more tragic way. This is a woman who had no history of mental illness, but within 12 days was depressed, wanted her baby adopted, even though that baby was very, very much wanted. Again, people didn't pick up on how unusual, how strange this was for this woman, and see that as something that we needed to pay attention to. And she repeated these thoughts, and again, within a short period of time, she had died. And all of this being very unusual, very strange for her. Now, remember at the start, I mentioned about that 2017 morbidity inquiry, which looked at a group of women who had a previous history of postpartum psychosis or of bipolar disorder. And we looked at those women to see what happened to them when they had another baby, and learned some lessons from that, different types of lessons. So these are lessons about preventing that illness coming back again, reducing the risk of a postpartum psychosis happening the next time. And some of those lessons were to make sure that any woman has a history of any type of psychotic illness or psychosis should be regarded as high risk. And also we should be asking people about their family history. If somebody in their family has a history of psychosis occurring in the perinatal period, and particularly if they themselves have a mood problem, then we should be regarding them as at significant risk. And often those patterns sort of run true. So if a woman's mother, let's say, became ill at 6 days postnatally, then there may be the chance that that's the sort of time scale that she might be at risk as well. And so the recommendations from that inquiry were very much about our responsibility as professionals to make sure that if somebody has an illness, that she's told about the risks in future pregnancies so that she's fully informed, and that she and her partner know about risk reduction strategies, because there are lots of things we can do to reduce that risk. And one of those really important things is to make sure that she's referred in a subsequent pregnancy as well. These are just some of the things to think about, making sure that people think about inpatient care as well as being very important, and that we know. And sometimes it seems people make heroic efforts to keep people out of hospital, when actually the best thing for that mother and baby is to go into a mother and baby unit where they have access to that expertise of care that helps keep them together while that mother is getting better from her illness. So I'm just going to finish up with my 3 big lessons out of this. First of all, the biggest lesson for me is always ask the question, is this different for this woman? Is this a change? Is this unusual? And if it is, make sure that you're closely tracking any emerging symptoms. Secondly, we all need to be aware, and this webinar today is helping that, about the risks and the patterns of perinatal mental illness. Does everyone have a good understanding of the illness? Is everybody part of that plan of recovery? And good communication, both between professionals, but between professionals and the woman and her family, and making sure the family are engaged and involved in that as well. If a partner doesn't know about perinatal mental illness, know why we worry as professionals about it, then how can he or she help their partner to get through it and recognize those warning signs and those concerning signs themselves? So we need to see families as there to support and as partners with us too. So I'm going to stop there, very conscious of the time, and I'm going to stop sharing and pass over to Sally.
Thank you, Rock. I'm just going to share my screen. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sally. I'm APP's training coordinator, and I have a background in academia. So I'm just going to talk to you very briefly about what we need to know about postpartum psychosis and introduce APP's antenatal education awareness campaign. So approximately half of those who develop postpartum psychosis have no history of serious mental illness. We also know that postpartum psychosis affects anyone giving birth from all backgrounds, classes, cultures, and education levels equally, which is why it's so vital that all expectant families and frontline health professionals know about it and can spot the signs and symptoms. So I'm going to talk to you today a bit about what we can do to help those who experience postpartum psychosis out of the blue. So as a direct response from listening to the voices of hundreds of those with lived experience, in 2021, we launched APP's Antenatal Education campaign, which aimed to increase knowledge of postpartum psychosis amongst expectant parents and antenatal educators. So the quote from Vlad on the right-hand side here highlights a familiar theme that we repeatedly see in APP. If only we'd known about postpartum psychosis, then things might have been different. So our stories repeatedly show that lack of awareness of postpartum psychosis has led to delays in spotting the signs and symptoms and seeking help, significant trauma, and for some, as we've already heard today, tragic loss of life. APP's YouGov survey in 2021 found that only 6% of expectant parents had actually heard about postpartum psychosis in their antenatal classes. So at APP, we believe that all parents need to know about postpartum psychosis so they can get the right help quickly. We also launched the antenatal survey in 2022. We surveyed over 160 antenatal education professionals to find out whether they were talking about postpartum psychosis and what the barriers were to this. So we found that nearly 90% of the respondents said that they believed postpartum psychosis should be discussed in antenatal education. And nearly 50% told us that they currently do talk about postpartum psychosis. The barriers to talking openly about PP were that they had limited time, they didn't feel they knew enough about the topic, and they didn't want to scare people. And some professionals felt that PP was too rare to include in antenatal education, or that any woman at risk of postpartum psychosis would already be known to perinatal services. So using APP's existing resources and data from the survey, we developed an antenatal education toolkit to help support professionals have these conversations. So you can support this campaign by signing up and sharing our toolkit, and we'll drop all those links in the chat for you. It's currently under consultation, so please feel free to offer us any feedback. So whilst we acknowledge that the idea of pregnancy complications is concerning and can be really scary, we should not pretend that they don't happen. So some of the fear surrounding the illness comes from the stigma. So presenting the facts, talking about the help that's available, and sharing the knowledge that people do get better can help address that stigma. Very briefly, we need to know the following to allow us to have a 5-minute life-saving conversation with every expectant parent. So we need to know that postpartum psychosis is a severe mental illness, and it can be scary, but with the right treatment and support, people can make a recovery. Whilst it's not as common as other perinatal mental illnesses, as far as serious life-threatening complications of childbirth go, postpartum psychosis is one of the most common, and it's a medical emergency. We need to know about the signs and symptoms, and that they can vary amongst individuals, and that they can happen very quickly after childbirth. We also need to know what the treatment is. So ideally, this should include an admission to an inpatient mother and baby unit alongside lots of other interventions, including psychological and peer support. So I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail about the signs and symptoms of postpartum psychosis, because we know recognising those early signs can actually save lives. So here's some work conducted by Jess and the team, looking at those early signs and symptoms in people who developed postpartum psychosis. So I want to point out it's important to know what's considered out of the ordinary for that person, which is why family and friends around them are so important at that time, and that these kinds of symptoms should be monitored really. So here you can see the most frequent symptoms reported were feeling excited, elated, racing thoughts, busy mind, increased energy, confusion, no need for sleep, and feeling detached or in a kind of surreal world. So acknowledging that in most cases there are early signs and symptoms before the full-blown delusions and hallucinations. And in fact, most people that are affected by postpartum psychosis can identify exactly when those early signs and symptoms started. So if we spot those signs and symptoms, we need to get help quickly. And some of the other speakers are going to go into a little bit more detail about what that should look like. Just going to talk a little bit about recovery, what else we need to know. So recovery from postpartum psychosis can be very complex. It's a very individual process, and unfortunately we don't have enough time to go into everything about that today. But I just wanted to pull out some key points really that are relevant to today's webinar. So using data from APP's survey in 2010 and 21, we know that the average inpatient stay can be around 6 weeks, but that recovery can take anywhere really between 6 months to 3 years and more. So the initial psychosis can be followed by periods of depression, anxiety, low confidence, self-stigma. And we found actually that between 43 and 60% of people that have had postpartum psychosis have a further kind of depressive illness, episode of illness after the acute phases of psychosis. The positive thing is that we know that some people who experience PP won't endure a period of mood disorder again in their lifetime. But we need to be mindful that up to half of people can experience further episodes of depression and anxiety even after the perinatal period. Importantly and relevant today, APP have found that 50% of people who experience postpartum psychosis will have suicidal thoughts in the year after being discharged from hospital. The reasons for these feelings are complex and very individual, and we need more research, and this is why we're here today really. But an important point that I want to make here really is that those who have suicidal thoughts and lose their life to postpartum psychosis don't always have the typical risk factors that we can sometimes see in the perinatal period. So there's often a lack of previous abuse or trauma, a lack of previous mental illness, a lack of social support. So we need to know more about this, and we need to acknowledge that there's a risk in the acute phases of psychosis, but also in the long-term recovery as well. We know that recovery from postpartum psychosis has a significant impact on dads, partners, co-parents, and the wider family. And APP's peer support service reflects this kind of ongoing support needed for the whole family in that long-term recovery. 1 in 3 people who use APP's peer support service say they might not be here today without APP's support. and I am one of those 3. So when I was ill in 2015, we had never heard of postpartum psychosis. We weren't able to access the treatment I needed, and I was separated from my daughter for treatment, which was incredibly traumatic at the time. I did have amazing health professionals advocating for me, but I had ongoing psychosis and severe depression, and it took me a long time to recover. After 10 months of struggling, I accessed APP's peer support and was signposted to the information and life-saving treatment I needed at the time, which for me was ECT or electroconvulsive therapy. I know I am fortunate to be sitting here presenting to you today. Without people like yourselves working together, it may have been a different story. So thank you for everything you do for families affected by postpartum psychosis. But I know we can do more. We need to make sure that all expectant parents and frontline health professionals know about postpartum psychosis. We need to know how to spot the signs and symptoms, know that recovery is complex and it can take a long time. And importantly, we need to offer hope that things will get better. So thank you for listening. I'm now going to hand you over to Professor Ian Jones, who's going to talk a little bit about what we can do for those at high risk of developing postpartum psychosis. Thank you.
My name's Ian Jones. I'm Professor of Psychiatry at Cardiff University, Director of the National Centre for Mental Health and a trustee of APP. And I'm delighted to be involved in this webinar today, even though I can't join you live. I'm going to talk today about the issue about what we know about identifying women at high risk of PP. Sally's already discussed the 50% of women who have PP as their first episode of severe illness, the so-called out of the blue cases. But for some women, for at least half, we know that they have a psychiatric history that puts them at high risk. I'm going to say something about what we know about them, and then at the end, say something about how we manage these women. So first question, why is it important to know about who is at high risk of postpartum psychosis? Well, I think it helps us help women make those difficult decisions about pregnancy, particularly about taking, stopping, or switching medication. And for services, it will help us identify which women need close monitoring through pregnancy and the postpartum period. And I think an important point to make as well is that nowhere else in psychiatry can we identify women who are currently well that maybe are at a 50% or more risk of a severe episode of illness. And there really are unrivaled opportunities to work with women preventatively and to ensure that any episode is picked up early. And of course, for research, and I'm not going to talk about that today, that link can help us understand the pathophysiology, the etiology of puerperal triggering. First point to make is that there's no doubt that the postpartum is a period of high risk for these severe episodes, these puerperal psychotic episodes. Now that evidence goes back to the studies of Robert Kendall in Edinburgh in the 1980s when he found that very high risk of admission to hospital in that immediate postpartum, and those findings were replicated by Rock Cantwell, one of our speakers today, and colleagues, using the whole of Scotland and using electronic health records. But what we do know is that although the key marker is a past history of psychiatric conditions that puts women at risk, that is not uniform for all conditions. And if you look at the work of Trine Monk-Olsen and colleagues, Trine has been doing some brilliant work in Denmark for the last 10 or 15 years or so, looking at the risk of postpartum episodes. What we find is that women with a history of bipolar disorder, this follows up women for the first year after delivery who've had a range of prior admissions with a range of diagnoses, and it's the women with bipolar disorder, the red line here, where we find this very high risk of a severe episode in the early postpartum weeks resulted in admission. Almost 20% of women with a history of bipolar disorder were admitted in that first postpartum month. We know more than that, though. We know that it's not bipolar disorder in general that is the high-risk group, but women with bipolar 1 disorder are particularly at high risk. And this is data that comes from our Bipolar Disorder Research Network study with my wonderful colleague, Arianna De Florio, as first author on this paper. And what we found in this study was, although the risk of a postpartum or pregnancy episode of mood disorder was high across the mood disorder spectrum from bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and recurrent major depression, it was women with bipolar 1, the kind of more severe forms of bipolar disorder, that were in the very high risk group for a postpartum psychosis episode. So bipolar disorder puts you in that high risk group, particularly bipolar 1 disorder, but particularly a previous postpartum illness. This is again work from the BDRN study that looked at women for whom we had data on 2 pregnancies and looked to see if the psychiatric outcome of the first pregnancy predicted risk in second pregnancy. We found very strong evidence for women who'd had a postpartum psychosis in their first pregnancy that they were that led to a markedly increased risk of a recurrence after their subsequent pregnancies. In fact, in this study, we were able to publish this flowchart that, on the basis of a couple of questions, all the women in this study had bipolar disorder, remember, on the basis on a couple of simple questions, whether it's bipolar 1 or bipolar 2 disorder that they have experienced, and what happened, what was the psychiatric outcome of the first pregnancy. We were able to differentiate bipolar women who were in a very high risk group of postpartum psychosis, almost 45%, but also a group with bipolar 2 disorder who had been well following their previous pregnancy, whose risk of postpartum psychosis was just 1%. So we're getting some way down that line there of being able to individualize the risk assessment that we can do with a woman and to give her more targeted advice. Lastly, then, if having bipolar 1 and having a previous postpartum psychosis put you at high risk, when is the period of risk? Well, this is work from our wonderful chair of our session today, Jess Herron, who in her PhD published this data that showed that it really was, the week 1 postpartum that was the high risk period. And in fact, in that study, when we looked at the risk of the days following delivery for women who had it onset in their first postpartum week, it was day 1, day 2, or day 3. So I said I'd say something about management just at the end. Why is that important? Well, one thing that is very clear, this is work from a wonderful colleague Claire Dolman, trustee of APP, who did this fantastic qualitative study of the experiences of women with bipolar disorder in the perinatal period. And what came out of that very clearly was that women found it difficult to get the information they needed from services, with one woman saying it was like bashing her head against a brick wall. So we need to do better. We need to ensure that women with bipolar disorder are aware of the high risk in the perinatal period and the risk of postpartum psychosis. And we need to make those individual assessments of women with their particular histories of illness and treatment response and giving them advice. Remember, it's not just medication, that there are psychological and social ways in which we can help women reduce risk. But definitely for some women, continuing medication may be the best option. And we need to consider the risks and benefits of all options here, of stopping, switching, or continuing current medication, remembering that nothing risk-free. And the last thing I just wanted to say is that clearly these women with the histories that we've talked about are in that very high-risk group, and they should be referred early, before pregnancy if possible for preconception counselling, but certainly in early pregnancy, and when the pregnancy is known, to specialist perinatal teams that have been set up around the UK in recent years. So with that, I'll finish. I hope I haven't taken too much time, and I'll hand you back to our chair. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. I'll now pass over to Dr. Judy Shakespeare.
Hello. Oh no, I'm so sorry my picture's not there. However, I am going to try and share my screen. Is that working?
Yes, Judy, we can see that. Thank you.
That's such a relief. I'm so sorry. Okay, so I'm going to talk about psychosis, suicide, and the role of your GP, but it could actually just as well be your health visitor or midwife, the person in universal services who's likely to be your first point of contact if you're psychotic, or if you think someone in your family is psychotic. And in this role, I am a retired GP, but I'm really talking as a former Embrace editor, having looked from before the second millennium at deaths from suicide in the confidential inquiry, and very, very distressing it's been, particularly because there are numerous opportunities that had been missed in a lot of women's cases. But I'm going to talk very much on a much more practical level, really, than the previous speakers have spoken. So I think that, as I said, that there's this important first point of contact, and then the role for GPs, health visitors, etc., also goes all the way through recovery and in knowing that women need to plan for their future pregnancies. So I'm not going to talk about the high risk women. Hopefully they will have been identified. They will have a plan. The families will know who to contact if things look as though they're going awry. I'm going to talk about the 50% of women where psychosis happens out of the blue. And of course, because of Sod's law, it's usually out of hours or at a weekend. And it's just out of the ordinary. People will recognise that something's just not quite right. It's really odd, strange. And I think for the professionals who are put into the position, the important thing is to be curious and suspicious. Just listen to that flag that says there's something funny going on here. Listen to the family. What is the woman normally like? What's normal for her? And don't get drawn into labeling this the same way somebody else has labeled it. These illnesses evolve sometimes very quickly, but the woman may have been seen in A&E. She may have been told she's got severe anxiety or borderline personality disorder. But judge it for yourself. Actually think, is that right? I'm going to move past the slide that Rox already showed. What we need to do is we need to ask these women directly about suicide. And this is really hard. And it's really hard to know what questions to ask. But here are a few thoughts of ways that you could phrase it. I'm not going to say them because they're just a hint. We need to do this sensitively and kindly and listen. We need to get rid of these myths about asking about suicide. It doesn't make it happen. Women are often hugely relieved to be able to talk about their feelings and thoughts, which are really terrifying. And as someone else has already said, having a child is not a protective factor. So what you need to know is what you need to do, and you need to prevent avoidable harm, things escalating, self-harm, harm to others, suicide. So this is, as other people have said, a psychiatric emergency. That means that the woman should be assessed within 4 hours, according to the NICE guidelines. She might need assessing faster than that if she's sitting on a window ledge, but within at least 4 hours. I don't think it's for the GP, health visitor, midwife to make the detailed assessment and diagnosis. If you even think of psychosis as a possibility, refer, don't wait until tomorrow. To do that, you need to know the pathways, and you need to know who to contact and what the emergency telephone numbers that you need to ring are, depending on whether it's in hours, out of hours, etc. And you need to risk manage this situation, because we know it can evolve very, very quickly. And we need to make sure that we keep the woman and the child safe in this time. But it may be very inappropriate to leave the family to supervise this situation. So, final point, pick up the phone and call for help. Don't wait. Don't write a letter. Judge who you call by the emergency and urgency of the actual situation you're in. I'm going to move on now to the other 2 times that I talked about. I think it's important for us to manage expectations. GPs should expect the woman to make a full recovery and offer hope, and not accept less. They need to understand, or we need to understand, that this process is going to be very, very long and slow. And there's a danger that people may feel compassion, professionals may feel compassion fatigue and just think, well, this is just going on and on, there's nothing I can do. Don't give up. And I think the point that has already been made is that during recovery, other psychiatric illnesses get in the way, particularly severe depression after psychosis, but also PTSD, anxiety, a whole range of other things. And that means that the suicidal risk carries on. It's not just during psychosis, it's during these other periods when women just feel that they're never going to get better. What can a GP do? I don't think GPs should be expected to manage the mood stabilizing or severe major tranquilizer medications if they don't know how to use them. If a woman needs to change her medication, then she needs to see her specialist, or she needs, or advice. She might need to be referred back. But GPs can listen, they can support, they can advocate for women. And they need to understand that there is this suicidal risk during recovery. Take it seriously. They need to know that forward planning works for the next pregnancy. It prevents further psychosis. So they need to make sure that they refer back to specialist services for that advice before the next pregnancy. And I think we need to remember that we're all part of the solution in this. We all need to work together and to understand the limitations that we all have, but also the benefits that we get from working together. I'm going to skip that slide, but I'm going to talk about this slide because during looking at all these cases, there were some professionals who gave exceptional care. A midwife stayed for a woman many hours, 8, 10, 12 hours, I can't remember how long it was, at a single lady's home, because they were waiting for the psychiatric assessment and they were waiting for the ambulance, etc., etc. She just didn't leave her because she didn't feel she could. She didn't feel it was safe to. A health visitor visited every day and called psychiatric services every day, trying to make a difference. GP repeatedly doing the same thing, escalating harm. I think although this is all admirable in the health service today, this is unsustainable. The pathways just have to work, and we have to make them work. Here are just some resources that you may not know about. One is a good practice points for health visitors that we wrote with APP, and the IHV have agreed to make it available without the paywall up until next Monday, so that might be useful for you to look at. And then I'll just draw to an end and say thank you and hand over to Giles.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Judy. That was really helpful. I'm just going to try and share my screen. I think you might need to stop sharing yours.
I'm trying to.
No problem. Hopefully, that's now shared my screen, I think.
Yes, we can see it, Giles. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So thank you very much, everyone. So my name is Giles Beresford. I'm the National Specialty Advisor to NHS England. And I'm also the chair of Action on Postpartum Psychosis. So it's great to be here and part of this talk. And what I was going to talk about really was just how do we access these perinatal mental health services. So we talked a lot about them and we said how important they are. I think it's just really important for us to think about, well, what does that really mean? What we've seen over the last few years is a complete revolution in perinatal mental health services and the care that they're able to offer. And so since 2016, what we've seen is there's been an enormous increase in perinatal mental health services in the community across the United Kingdom. Since 2019, we've had specialist community perinatal mental health teams in all areas of England. And similarly, we've got specialist teams in Scotland and in Wales, and we've got some that are coming in Northern Ireland as well. We've got 4 new mother and baby units, and there's 1 new mother and baby unit in Wales. And so our total mother and baby unit offer now is 22 units with a total of 174 beds. However, there's still no mother and baby unit in Northern Ireland. What do these services do? So we've got the inpatient mother and baby units, but we've also got specialist community perinatal mental health teams, which are a really important part of the pathway. And the point of these teams is that they can work with women and with families from preconception right up until 2 years after the birth of the baby. And what they're able to do is offer this a holistic biopsychosocial assessment, which is a phrase which psychiatrists love to roll out. But what it really means is that we think about women and families holistically. We think about the biological processes, which we know an important part of psychosis and of psychiatric illnesses. But we also think about how would the women that we're treating ordinarily respond, and also what are the social situations which our families are in at that time. And this helps us to identify, well, what's the current risk? So we've heard a lot saying that bipolar affective disorder is a clear risk for developing postpartum psychosis. And by assessing that level of risk, we're able to assess, well, what needs to happen to put a comprehensive plan in place to support and look after the families at that time. And that management plan has to consider all the different stages of the pregnancy. So and of the perinatal period. So think, what do you need to do during pregnancy? What do you need to put in place during actual labour? What needs to happen in the first few hours, days, weeks, and then months after the postpartum period to make sure that you keep things as safe as they possibly can for mothers and babies. And another important role of what our job is making sure that we link across. And so you already know that there are so many people involved in maternity care. So whether that's the general practitioner, health visitors, midwives, the obstetrician, but also this from a psychiatric aspect, think about the normal community mental health teams, home treatment teams, other psychiatrists who may be involved. And so an important part of the perinatal psychiatrist role is making sure that all of that information is joined up so that everybody knows this is the plan, this is how we're going to try and maintain a safe environment for mums, make sure that they stay well, and if they don't stay well, make sure they get well as quickly as possible in as safe an environment as possible. And what can they do in a psychiatric emergency? So the key thing is to try and identify those women who are at high risk of developing postpartum psychosis and putting a plan in place for them. And so a lot of our job for women who've got bipolar affective disorder or had previous episodes of postpartum psychosis is making sure that we work together to make a plan and put a plan in place. And what we often do is we plan for the worst. We imagine, well, what happens if you do become really unwell? What would you like us to do? What could we do to try and keep things as safe as possible and try and help moms to be in control of those choices at that time when they're well? And ultimately, we always hope for the best. So we hope that our plans are never needed. We hope that in actual fact that because we plan so well during pregnancy, we've reduced the risks as much as we can. We're in a situation where actually we don't need to enact the plan for the worst case scenario because we've managed to avoid people becoming unwell. But the other important aspect of this is recognizing, just as Sally was saying, that half of these cases happen out of the blue. And so we can't plan for it, they happen. And so in order to make sure that we can respond to those emergencies, training and education is just really important. And again, that needs to come from these specialist teams. It's making sure that everybody who's involved with the maternity process is aware of what postpartum psychosis is and is aware of what do we need to do to support women who become unwell at that time. And the object of that is trying to make sure that we have that holistic assessment and we make sure that women and babies are placed in an environment which is safe. And what do I really mean by that? Then I suppose I'm really saying that women who have postpartum psychosis have that ready access into an inpatient mother and baby unit. And we've said this for a long time, that women who require access into a psychiatric hospital in the postpartum period ought to be admitted into a psychiatric inpatient mother and baby unit so that they can have that conjoined admission together with their baby so they're not separated at that time. And what we've made sure is that for the service specifications, so the standards which all mother and baby units have to run to, is saying that it's important that you can admit acutely ill women in an emergency at any time of day and night so that you're able to be admitted straight into mother and baby unit. And to try and facilitate that, we have a standardized referral form which is found at this website. So NHS web beds, if you put in NHS web beds, you'll find our site, and there you'll be able to find where the beds are available. So we've got 22 beds across the country, and you'll be able to see which unit has got a bed available. We want women to be admitted into their local unit, but if that's not possible, we just need them to be admitted into a unit so that they're not separated from their baby. We want to make sure that they're placed in a safe environment. We want to make sure that we don't keep women at home for too long if it's not a safe thing to do. But also we want to make sure that women are not admitted separated from their baby just because we've not been able to find a bed for them. So we need to make sure we work together to find that bed. And the reason why we think this is so important is that mother and baby units are staffed by perinatal specialists. That's all we do, is look after moms and babies who are psychiatrically unwell after having a baby. So we are staffed with experts who are able to look after babies to keep them safe, look after moms to keep them safe, and to treat the mental illness and to work on that mother-infant relationship all the way through the recovery phase as moms start to get better. What we know is that we've had fewer suicides from women who've been admitted into an MBU compared to women who are admitted into a general psychiatric unit. And we also know that there's much greater satisfaction and the outcomes are better in terms of that mother-infant relationship. And we've seen that with those successive APP surveys in 2010 and 2021. You know, the APP has worked really hard to campaign for the expansion of the MBUs, and they've been really successful. So we've got these 4 extra units which have already opened. We've got a 5th extra unit which will open soon, a unit which is opened in Wales. And so we know that they've been very successful at campaigning for that. We also know that the APP has been essential at trying to support those MBUs. So they've done an awful lot of training for the new staff who are working in those services. And the other thing which is now coming online across all those units is making sure we have peer support workers working within those services. Because one of the things that we know is that often I'd be telling women, you will get better, you will make a recovery. But to be fair, they don't really believe me. It's actually hearing it from someone who's got that lived experience. You can say, I've been here, I know what you're going through, I understand it, and I've made a full recovery, and they can see with their own eyes that a recovery is possible. I was just going to try and bring us through a brief summary of the learning. We've heard so much. We've had some fantastic speakers. So thank you very much to all of our great speakers that we've had so much. We know that there is a government aspiration to reduce maternal deaths, and we know we have to work really hard because it's really tricky to do that. And so we have to work that. And if we are going to do that, then we have to look specifically at suicide, and how do we reduce the numbers of suicides that we're seeing. We've heard from Rock, we've heard about the Embrace data, which is coming out, and saying that perinatal mental health is clearly linked. Suicide is one of the major reasons why women are dying in the postpartum period. We also know that it's linked in with that previous trauma, with low social support, with substance misuse, domestic violence, previous mental illness, and the loss of a child. But we also know that postpartum psychosis can happen to anyone. And we also know that the postpartum psychosis deaths are not specifically linked into low socioeconomic background or to substance misuse or into domestic violence, because it can happen to anyone. And so we need to recognise that sometimes we need to just look at the level of illness that we see in the women and to make sure that we put something in place to support them regardless of what their background is. We shouldn't be thinking that because they're from a nice background that they're going to stay safe. That is not the way that the world works. We need to look at the racial and ethnic differences in maternal mortality. And we really need to work to reduce what are the barriers to accessing our services. How do we make our services more accessible to make sure that we're more inclusive? We need to try and make sure that everybody understands the symptoms of postpartum psychosis. We need to we understand the importance of a good assessment and of urgent action. And we also know that often with postpartum psychosis, it's a rapidly fluctuating course. And so just because we've done an assessment and someone seems to be doing okay, we need to make sure that we have that continuous assessment, because we know that things can rapidly fluctuate and the risk can become very real very quickly. We need to make sure that women who have got suspected postpartum psychosis are seen really quickly, they're seen rapidly, and that they have that same day admission into an MBU. We also need to be thinking about how do we make sure that we give that positive message of hope that women do recover and they do get better. We also need to recognise that the recovery phase can be over a long period of time, that there is a high level of suicidality during that recovery period, and therefore it's just really important that we offer support. We recognise that you may have suicidal thoughts. We need to make sure that women have support during that time and people to talk to recognise that we can support them through that. And the expectation has to be that for a full recovery. And so we know that postpartum psychosis is a really treatable illness, that people do get better. It's just trying to find the right medication or the right treatment, and ECT can be life-changing and can make a real difference if that's needed. I suppose the overall message is that we've got over 1,000 people who've been listening to these talks, and I know that a lot of you will be people who are working with people in the perinatal period all the time. It's just to say a huge thank you, because what we know is that your work is saving lives. And so we need to keep working together to make sure that we do that. And I'm going to call that to an end there, and I'll stop sharing the screen and I will hand over to Jess to take questions and answers from the panel. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Giles, and thank you to all of our speakers today for their really inspiring and knowledgeable talks. We do have time for a few questions. There are lots of questions, so what we'll do is we'll put everything in a resource and we'll get that out to you. Also, today will be recorded, so anybody that signed up will also send that recording to them. So don't worry if you have to leave early. It will all come to you. So as chair's prerogative, I'm going to take the first question, but then I'll come to some other questions that have been left in the Q&A. So in Action on Postpartum Psychosis, we know that lived experience, stories and input is so powerful in precipitating change. What more can we do to embed patient representation? Where else do we need to be heard? Giles, can I come to you first for that one?
Yes, you can, and I can come off mute as well. So yeah, so I think it is really important. So lived experience has been really valuable to the whole expansion of perinatal mental health services already. So that it is really because of the voices of people with lived experience and hearing the stories that have been shared today. So thanks to Laura, Sally, and to Rich, who've added to a whole army of people who have shared their experiences and said, this is what happens. And has also worked with clinicians, with academics to help us to come up with a plan, say, this is how we improve services. And so since 2016 and the expansion of those services that we've seen so far, a lot of that expansion has been led by that collaboration of people with lived experience, as well as academics and clinicians, to say, these are the services which are needed in each local area. These are the services which will be acceptable to the women in your local area. And we need to continue with that collaborative approach to make sure that these services are accessible to all communities in our local areas, to make sure that all women are able to access services as and when they need it, and that we're seen and then embedded in our local communities so that all women are identified and treated promptly. And I think APP has been brilliant at supporting us in doing that, and think about the work that we've got. So in my mother and baby unit in Birmingham, having an APP peer support worker has been totally game-changing to our service, because suddenly women have got someone to talk to they really identify with, and then helping us think about the policies that we can put in place to continue to improve our services. So yes, it's something I feel really strongly about and really passionate about, and I think it's something which, yeah, we need to just keep on doing and leading the way in doing it.
And Sally, it might be useful to come to you to talk a little bit about the support of people with lived experience who are giving talks or sitting on patient panels and helping to influence those services.
Yeah, I think, again, APP are just a huge network of women, families, everyone that's been affected by postpartum psychosis. So we have that sort of support network in place anyway, in terms of a peer support. But we have lots of different policies and procedures in terms of how we support with people with lived experience that are doing certain things. So we have peer support volunteers and trained staff. So we have lots of different training. We run lived experience talks like we have done today. So we need all those mechanisms in place to make sure that people are supported. So to do that, we make sure that, you know, people are there, we debrief them, we make sure we're working as a community to support people, particularly, you know, like today, topics are very emotional and heavy, making sure that people have got that support that they need through peer support and through training kind of as well. So.
Kathy, was there anything you wanted to add to that as well?
Thank you, Jess. I would really just echo Giles's point, and, you know, as a GP and a member of the primary care team, you know, really to remind that we have patient representation or patient groups within your local primary care or surgery setting, but actually all along the pathway, so across primary care into secondary care, and how we develop our services going forwards. I think that the sort of really what's happened in the perinatal mental health space has been an exemplar, and we just really need to keep up that momentum and engagement with those with lived experience. It's so critical in how services for our patients are developed going forward. So really just to echo support of it.
Thank you. There's a question here in the Q&A. Women from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, the most recent inquiry shows they're 4 times more likely to die following childbirth. What can health professionals do to particularly target this group and help to make mental health issues less taboo? Rock, can I come to you for that one?
Sure, Jess, thanks. Yeah, it's a really concerning finding from the inquiry, although it's really important to point out that that's the finding from all the whole inquiry. It's not a finding for those who die from mental health causes, and we don't see quite that disparity, but we're looking at smaller numbers, so it's hard. We need to look over a longer period of time to see whether we're seeing that excess replicated as well amongst those with mental health difficulties. But it's really concerning, and I think the inquiries themselves make a number of suggestions about how that should be done in terms of reaching out to hard to reach populations, recognizing that there may be social and cultural barriers to people accessing services, both universal services and specialist services, and recognizing that there's often coexisting social deprivation and social disadvantage, and that they may be barriers to accessing care as well, and making the services that we do provide more friendly and more welcoming to people from minority ethnic and other minority communities as well. So we have a long way to go, but I think there are really good pointers within the inquiries about what we could be doing to improve the quality of the services, both the universal and the specialist services that we offer at the moment.
Hey, does anyone else want to add anything to that one?
I suppose, yeah, just say it. So it's all about how do we make our service acceptable, isn't it, really? So the communities are there. We need to be reaching out and making sure that it's okay to come to us. And what we know is that a lot of women, there's this huge fear and huge stigma attached to mental illness, but also this fear around whether babies are going to be removed from their care if people know that you're not doing well enough. So how can we sort of disabuse some of these myths that in actual fact, we're not here to separate families. We're here to keep families together. We're here to make sure that women are able to be the mother they want to be and to function as well as they can. So it's trying to decrease that fear and to try and decrease the stigma so that we are acceptable to them and that we become more accessible to them because they're happy to come forward to us and we can reach out to them as well.
Laura, there's a question here for which may be best for you. What kind of things can health professionals do to make it more likely people will be open about their symptoms?
I really loved what Judy said about asking outright about suicidal thoughts or feelings, just putting words to, as someone else said about not needing a diagnosis, I think that was Judy as well, not jumping to a diagnosis straight away. Because first of all, we don't have the language, might not have those kind of tools within our system because we're not taught this stuff at school. It goes way, way, way back to even identify what we're experiencing. But definitely that kind of shock factor, dialed down fear, sort of dialed down, and the reassurance you're not going to have your baby taken away from you, and that it isn't your fault, because that is so much of it is the shame. I can safely say that shame was the biggest symptom that I was experiencing. What will people think? Am I not enjoying this? Am I not being the best mum I can be? That all really helped. But meeting APP was also just incredible for me. And I remember this came up earlier, but somebody saying that an active recovery keeps her for a long recovery. So keep on talking actually is adding to the conversation is going to keep me well, I think.
Thanks, Laura. There's a question here about face-to-face visits, and should we be mandating more face-to-face visits in the perinatal period by health visitors and other professionals? Do you feel that the current increasing rates are due to withdrawal of face-to-face visits, or do you think it's more complicated than that? Brock, can I come to you for that one?
Yeah, sure. It's undoubtedly during the early stages of the pandemic, when there was an almost universal withdrawal of face-to-face contact across many services. Actually, I think perinatal mental health services stayed a bit as a beacon and in many cases did not stop seeing people. Special services did not stop seeing people face-to-face, recognizing often the urgency of needing to see people and the importance of making that holistic assessment and doing that in person. But without a doubt, they reduced. I think there are both pros and cons. What we've seen, if it's a silver lining at all, is that we have arranged that people can engage in a range of different ways. And for some people, not having to come to an appointment has made it easier for them to engage with their health professional. But what we need to recognize is, I think, what's quite distinctive about perinatal mental illness, about the times when it's really important to see people face to face, the challenge of trying to do a proper assessment with somebody who might have symptoms of psychosis, of postpartum psychosis, for instance, or the challenge of trying to make sure that you're seeing how mother and baby are together on a video link, which is much more difficult than actually seeing them in more natural surroundings. So there are positives in terms of increasing choice, but we need to be judicious and careful about how we use those different tools and make sure that at the end of the day, we're seeing women and their families in the setting that's most suited to them and that's best in terms of understanding the difficulties and their problems.
And Kathy and Judy, I guess you're seeing a huge shift in the way that GP services are provided. Do you think there are opportunities that we need to take account of when we're planning safety netting for women? And
I'm going to leave. I'm sorry about my camera. I did order a new one because I realized it wasn't working, but it only arrived this morning. I really don't think I can talk to this because it's 12 years since I retired. So I'm going to leave that one to Kathy.
Thank you. I think it's a very interesting question. I think the reality is that it needs a real deep dive, for a multidisciplinary deep dive to understand whether there is a link. But I think certainly I'm a really big fan of patient empowerment. And I think that choice is critical to this, and that actually, as we have diversified the ways people can access health services, we offer people choice. But that really critical to that decision making as the healthcare professional, I'm not just speaking as with a GP hat on, is that we help to inform patients and their families about the risks. So we know separately in our work in remote GP consultations is that GPs have been doing telephone consultation, telephone triage since before the pandemic. So there's a level of expertise nationally in that arena, and we recognise that there are certain cases where remote doesn't work, and we never switched off that facility throughout the pandemic. We would triage, and if someone needed to be seen, they were seen. And I think the same goes here, that a patient may choose to see you remotely, and then as part of that clinical encounter, you give that patient the choice and that information about, actually, I'm not happy continuing with a remote consultation, let's divert or resort back to face, or and that's a tool that we use in general practice day in, day out. And I think really work that you're doing to empower patients to increase education amongst the general population about postpartum psychosis is valuable, because an informed patient is for me the real vital piece.
So we've just got a couple of minutes left. So Laura, I just want to come to you, and then Richard, I'll end with you with this question. What's the one most important thing a health professional can do in making sure that women with postpartum psychosis get better?
I think just going back to believing them, even if they're the illest they ever come across, their delusions or conspiracies or whatever their plans might be. I think listen to them. Of course, they're going to have limited knowledge of what that person is like, but as people were saying, family, friends, people around, work colleagues, we're using the word normal, and that is a scary word, but everybody does have their own rhythm of normality. And if anything is going askew from that, it might be nothing, it could be nothing, which is a great day, but it could be something scary, and that's an amazing role to have. You could go on to save somebody's life. So it's not scary to ask if someone is feeling a certain way, and keep asking.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I'm going to be completely honest. Until we went through this as a family a year ago, I kind of thought mental health was just something that happens to other people, in the same way that a lot of people at the moment still believe that climate crisis and climate change isn't real. It's only now I realise mental health is a real thing, and it's really affecting people. It's affected us. The main thing that I really want to get across to GPs, anyone who deals with people suffering from PP, is to listen, but also is to observe. That I know this is horrible to talk about, but the last photo I've got of Alex 2 days before she died, there was this look on her face that I've not seen in her before. I've never seen anyone, and I never wish to see in anyone. There was something there. There was something there that I just wish that people would have been able to see in her. So listening, observing, but also acting immediately, without getting too specific in everything, because I know we're short of time. She was given or offered an appointment the next day, and another appointment about 3 days later. She was offered antidepressants of some sort that wouldn't have come into effect until 2 weeks later, which was far too late. Again, I promise you I'm not blaming those individuals involved, but I just wish that it could have been treated like a medical emergency. If someone's having a heart attack, you take them to hospital straight away. she was having exactly the same issue, and she could have been saved if that person who was with her, or those people who were involved with her, could have been aware and alert enough at the time.
Thanks so much, Richard. And I think it's so powerful, and I think that with these seminars we're really reaching a lot of people. So I hope that the knowledge and information that's been shared people will take to their own practice. So just lastly, I'd like to thank all the speakers today for sharing their knowledge to make birth safer and less traumatic for women affected by postpartum psychosis. Whatever your role as a healthcare professional, we'd be delighted if you would join us in increasing public and health professional awareness of postpartum psychosis in whatever ways you can. If you've got ideas about ways you can help, please just get in touch with us. There's an email and website in the chat. There'll be a landing page that we'll email around with resources, the recording, and an evaluation questionnaire for you to give us your thoughts on today. Please register your interest with us as well to stay up to date with APP's antenatal campaign and our work in general. There's lots more training, in-depth training for specific health professionals. There's a day coming up about supporting dads, a day coming up about supporting families from diverse communities. If you would like to support our work, again, there's a link in the chat and also on the landing page. And you can, we've got fundraising runs, skydives, events, bake sales that you can get involved with in. So just thank you all hugely for giving up your lunchtime, and thanks from all of us, and enjoy the rest of your day.